a lot of big findings from week one. We'll talk about all of the work rates, all of the snap shares, all the things you can expect to look forward to in week two that we learned from week one. I'm Chris Spags, joined once again by one of the premier emerging minds in the DFS industry, a man who has his own YouTube channel, and you should be following him right now on Twitter at Sal Vetri DFS. Sal Vetri, how are you doing, Sal?
What's going on, Spags? Yeah, I'm doing good. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm excited for this. I feel like the XFL still feels like kind of untreaded ground. And I feel like again, I said it last week, we're like pioneers here, just breaking it down each week. And I guess the first question to ask you, we got to do some promo stuff, but what was your big finding from week one? I watched all the games. I'm sure you watched them as well. A lot of data out there. I saw you tweeting some of the target shares pretty much the second that they were available online. So what do you feel like was your big learning moment from week one that people might be interested in following in week two?
Yeah, so I think a couple of things. We still probably don't have a great idea of just what these connections between the wide receivers and quarterbacks are going to look like. But the biggest things that I saw were something I was expecting, just how the league was playing out rules-wise. We talked about it last week. Just running backs seeming like they're not needed from a fantasy perspective because of just so many committees approaches and not a lot of running backs were used in the passing game, not as much as I was expecting. So that's one thing that stood out. And then also tight ends for fantasy purposes, seeing that there's viable, at least tight ends, a lot of tight ends being used in the slot as wide receivers, probably 3 or 4 teams doing that, which is not something I was expecting either.
Yeah, I think, there was one thing that jumped out to me, and I think we kind of saw it with the Cameron Artis-Payne chalk busting in particular. Like the teams don't have to run the ball, which I think is one thing that, the way we just think about the NFL, the way that it works with the play clock being bled out, the way that teams generally run things, the way that you want to have normally a running back who's going to be a favorite at home. That is going to be usually a thing in the NFL that does well for you. In the XFL, that wasn't the case where teams were ahead and were still just throwing kind of screen passes, throwing short passes to the flat, like low risk type passes just for the same effect of a run. Because of the running game clock, there's really no benefit to running if you have a decent passing offense and you trust your quarterback. Does that affect things for you moving forward? Like, are there running backs? Like for me, Jarrell Presley was a guy I was very big on, Cameron Artis-Payne as well. I think we kind of have to go back to square one basically with running backs to think about how we're approaching it. But I guess, how does that affect things? Are you going to have a much more narrow player pool at running back? Do you have a bigger one? Like, how do you feel like that's going to work out for you in week two?
Yeah, so last week I set a rule that at most 2 running backs per lineup, and I ended up only getting around like 5% of my lineups with 2 running backs. So I pretty much just went with 1 running back approach, and that's what I'm going to do moving forward. We saw last week, if you take out Nick Holley, who's still listed as a running back but played as a slot wide receiver, pretty much no running backs were getting over 15 routes run alone. There was 2 or 3 guys who went above that. Those are the guys that we can look at moving forward. But a lot of these running backs were running like 10 routes. And when you're in a backfield where 2 to 3 guys are going to get carries, it makes it really hard to pay a similar price point for a running back as a guy who's going to go out there and run 25 to 30 routes as a wide receiver. So the lack of usage in the passing game for these guys, yeah, it's definitely going to be something moving forward that if you're using optimizers, I probably wouldn't want more than 2 running backs in a lineup. And even then, it doesn't seem that ideal.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting approach from lineup builds in week two. And, there is still a bit of an edge here. And I think one of the bigger edges that you'll find is with our projections that we have at Awesemo.com. So if you go right now to Awesemo.com/join and use the promo code XFL 2020, you can get yourself $40 off on an XFL early bird special. Even though it's week two, the projections are new we are really one of the only sites out there doing projections. And quite frankly, a lot of our guys did well with them. I know Jake Hari was up on some of the tournaments, especially after the day one, really dominating one of the bigger tournaments out there. Awesemo also finished in the top 3 in some of the XFL tournaments. So I think our projections do provide a bit of an edge. This is still mostly untreaded ground for a lot of people out there. So go to Awesemo.com/join, use that promo code XFL 2020 for $40 off. So that's just $50 for the entire XFL season right now. And again, we're doing all the content right now, and Awesemo's projections are a great way to win money in these new sports. I mean, Sal, real fast, I know, the WNBA was one big way that you kind of got your footing as a DFS analyst. Tell the people real fast, like what there is of an edge in terms of a new league or just a league with less data out there and less attention being paid to it overall.
Yeah, I think that's what it is. I think it's a lot of the times in the NFL, well, people just know players, kind of know what to expect from a workload. Maybe there's some things that you catch up on like a week later than a lot of people. And just, yeah, overall, the content's going to be out there a lot more for sports like the NFL, but we're still trying to project just what happens in this league, whether it is like we're saying here, something where you don't have to rely on running backs as much in the passing game. So you kind of find edges just based on information, based on really after week one, having some sort of sample of data and going from there. And at that point, it's just about exploiting them in the type of game mode. So like your biggest edge is going to be still in cash games in this format, because you kind of know what's more reliable. And then from there, you can try and outweight some of these GPPs if you want to play 150 max or 20 maxes. If you're still entering like one lineup into a 150 max, yeah, you're probably not having the greatest of edges, but yeah, you can definitely take advantage of it by playing the right contests.
Yeah, so definitely a bit of an edge out there. Again, that promo code's XFL 2020, $40 off, so just $50 for the entire XFL season. And I think this is one that can pay off pretty fast, especially as Sal mentioned, just playing it close to the vest, playing the cash games. Definitely one way to make some of your money here back right away from that package. So go check it out right now. XFL 2020 at osmo.com/join. All right, Sal. So let's get into the games here, because I feel like we kind of talked about the overarching themes. Game one, we got New York heading into a game with DC. DC, both teams won in week one. DC, though, a 6.5 point favorite here at home. 27 implied points for DC, 20.5 implied points for New York. Matt McGloin really didn't have to do much, but one thing that did jump out to me in week one, New York really didn't run a lot of plays. Actually, the least plays in the league overall run by them. Could be a bit of Tampa Bay dominating the ball. Tampa Bay, to me, jumped out as the one team that was the most unlucky in week one. A lot of drops for Aaron Murray. Aaron Murray also kind of looked like crap, but he really just was unlucky as well. And it could be a change of the guard there as well, with Murray not practicing so far this week, unless that's changed recently. Sal, how are you feeling about this game here? And let's talk about the New York side first. Anybody jumping out to you is worthwhile? Nicole McKay in week one was one of the chalk plays, and doesn't seem to me like he's going to be worth his freight. And Osmo's projections as well. Not a great value for week two, it looks like.
Yeah, so from the New York side, I don't have much interest in Matt McGloin. It's really where he's priced at this point, and they ended up winning by 20 in week one. But you touched on it with Murray, and just the Tampa Bay offense wasn't moving the ball great. But New York scored twice pretty early in that game. In the second half, they had a defensive score, a reason why they didn't have as many plays. But McGloin wasn't that great. Like his overall rating, 82.8, looks okay compared to some of the other quarterbacks in the league last week. But they didn't move the ball at all the final three quarters of the game. Yeah, McKay, he had the 4 targets. The one deep target ended up being caught for 40 yards, and that's pretty much all he did. So I didn't really like what I saw from it. And where the price point is on Matt McGloin at 9,900, not that interested. He did attempt 5 deep passes, held below 30 attempts because of the big lead, but not something that I'm going to all that much. On the opposite side of this one, earlier, or I believe it might have been last night, Aaron Murray was ruled out. So they don't know who's going to be at this point. So right now on the depth chart, the backup's Taylor Cornelius. He would be the guy who would just fill into this role. But the assumption is that Quentin Flowers, who played a lot of Wildcat quarterback last week, will also do that and maybe even have a more extended role. The problem is Flowers is already 7,500, so he's already priced up. So even if he sees a little bit more work, it's difficult to want to go there since he's now a quarterback and not a running back. And then Taylor Cornelius, his only start in college was his senior year at Oklahoma State. He was actually pretty good, 60% completions, ran for over 400 yards, 144.7 quarterback rating. So he's only $6,700 on DraftKings this week. We don't know if he's a starter. I'm just assuming that he is at this point. He's probably going to lose work to Quentin Flowers. But at $6,700, it's interesting when he's $4,000 less than some of the more other viable quarterbacks, depending on how you want to build this week.
Yeah, it is an interesting situation here, because I do think Quentin Flowers does jump out as a guy in week one where he got some of that garbage time work, as Sal mentioned, also was subbing in for Aaron Murray during parts of the game. In that second half in particular, it did seem like they were like, all right, we got to try something else here. And Flowers, when he was out there, I mean, he was taking deep shots. He had the same amount of deep completions as Aaron Murray did with a fraction of the attempts. And I do think Flowers would be an intriguing play, but it does seem with this Cornelius news, he's taken the majority of the first team reps, as Sal just mentioned. That does make Flowers a bit of a trap. So I guess the question is, Sal, do you think that's worth having any Flowers at all this week? Or is now this timeshare or possibly a majority of the work, and maybe even the same situation we saw in week one with Murray taking a lot more of the work, is that going to make you not have any Flowers at all, even though it seemed like people are going to be really excited to play Flowers? I was, but I think this news certainly makes it a spot where I will have probably no Flowers, which kind of sucks.
If they list him as the starting quarterback, I'll have a lot more interest there, because then I assume he's going to get the far majority, if not all of the work. But if they're going to list Taylor Cornelius as the starting quarterback, I'll assume that he sees a role very similar to what Aaron Murray's was last week. And at this point, it just doesn't give me as much interest in Flowers. So if Cornelius is starting, I'll actually have some outside interest in Cornelius. He'll still be like the fifth guy that I would want to get to at quarterback this week. But the price point becomes interesting. Flowers, they already have him priced 7,500. He's only going to be interesting to me if he's named the starter.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, and certainly something to watch the news for here. A couple guys here, that are, I think, interesting. I mean, Flowers really, I think, one of the guys that has been hyped coming into the league. Talked about him in a lot of the content last week, and he did seem like a bit of a trap in week one. But with the enthusiasm people had for the double pass and for trickery, that really didn't come up as much as you might think. But yeah, I think it's just an interesting thing to talk about with Flowers. I know we're talking about the New York DC game, but Flowers is just a guy who I feel like is very trappy now that with the Cornelius news coming in there. How about the running backs for New York? And I guess you talked a little bit about the wide receivers, but Joe Horn, I think at wide receiver, really targeted well, running exclusively out of the slot for the most part in week one. Living up to his daddy, I guess, if you want to go with that route as well. A lot of people, if you just played the guys who were sons of famous receivers in the NFL in week one, you probably did pretty well cash-wise. But this week, Joe Horn's still cheap, still getting the routes. He did run 27 routes in week one, which were pretty close to amongst the front runners there with McKay and Colby Pearson. Is Joe Horn a guy you were believing in as much as Osmo? Because the projection value-wise for him really does jump off the page.
Yeah, so in terms of factoring in the price for Joe Horn, I think he looks good. There's definitely still some tight ends and wide receivers mainly that are underpriced this week. But yeah, I'm fine getting to Joe Horn. So he ran the third most routes on the team at 27, but he was targeted 7 times, which led the team by 2 over tight end Powell. So he was actually targeted on over 26% of his routes run, which is good to see. The issue is that he's definitely cheap, so that's the upside. The only issue is those 7 targets, none of them were down the field. They were all short passes for the most part, less than the deepest pass was 16 yards, and the rest were pretty much around 10 or less. So that's the only concern with him is the upside. But at that price point, not a lot can hurt you there. So, yeah, I'm still fine getting to Joe Horn this week. It was nice to see that even in a game where they really didn't have to throw the entire fourth quarter with a 20-point lead, he still saw 7 targets and pretty much 3 quarters of work. At the running backs, to pretty much like close up the New York team and the New York offense, you saw Darius Victor, who came in as the backup. They only used 2 of their running backs, so that's good to see. Tim Cook and Darius Victor. Victor was the one who saw 70.6% of the overall running back touches, and he saw 3 receptions, ran more routes there. So at 4,100, he'd be the guy I get to. Like we touched on at the beginning of the show, I'd only want at most 2 running backs in my lineups this week. He wouldn't be like a first guy in, but if he made his way into a couple of flex spots, it would be Victor over Cook for me.
Yeah, I agree. Victor did look a little more involved in the pass game. Also a little more explosive overall in terms of yards after contact, 3.9 yards after contact for Victor compared to just 2 for each run for Tim Cook. And, mentioned it last week, even though it's impressive that Tim Cook is both the Apple CEO and the running back for a New York XFL team, still not a spot really where Tim Cook seems like the guy that's worthwhile. And also his projections as well back out Victor being the better play. So, maybe some contrarian value going to Cook, but it does seem like this New York running game, definitely not a focus. One guy I am a little bit intrigued by is Colby Pearson, and I know we kind of breezed by him. We talked about Joe Horn as well, but I do think with Horn's projection popping off the page, Pearson's price isn't great, but he did get the most deep targets on the team, saw 3 in week 1 from McGloin, and McGloin was really a little more conservative than I would have thought overall. He had this rep of being a gunslinger in the preseason, the scrimmages that the XFL had as well, and I don't think that he really did throw it as much deep as we would have thought. McKay in particular is a guy who really can catch those deep balls. He wasn't getting those looks. Only saw 1 deep target, did make a grab on it, but the workload for him, not that great. Is Pearson a guy you think can be worthwhile here? Because for me, he does seem like one of those dudes, and I think we kind of saw it in week 1 with guys like Austin Prohl, we mentioned a little bit earlier. Like Pearson's at a price where I don't think people will get there. But to me, he does seem like a guy who has some upside. Is Pearson somebody you imagine having it all, or is he just a guy that you're kind of losing amidst, the Joe Horn craziness that's going to go on for this week?
Yeah, I think it's more so the price on him. Like, I think he's fine. He ran 30 routes last week, led the team. That's nice to see. He saw 3 deep passes, deep targets, 20-plus yards from McGloin. So that was the most on the team as well. McKay ended up seeing, I believe, the other 2. There was 5 total. But yeah, Pearson at 7,200, he just kind of gets lost at that pricing range. I like a lot of guys that we'll get to in that 9K plus range, a couple guys in the 8K range. And then I think there's some really nice value plays like Horn. So I'm really not getting to much of like that 6 and 7K range at wide receiver. Not much stands out there for me.
Okay. Yeah, that's fair. I think Pearson did jump out with the deep targets for me there. He did get a touchdown as well. Obviously touchdowns going to be a thing that we have to figure out as we go in terms of TD equity. 1 game, not a big enough sample size, but Pearson a little bit more involved than I think one would have thought with a guy like McKay on the other side. If you were to look at these two guys side by side, you would think McKay is the guy that you'd really want to go to, but Pearson was at least as involved and could be even more so moving forward. The DC side, DC's defense was really what got them going in week one. But Cardale Jones was PFF's top graded quarterback in week one. He really did well for the most part. I mean, the accuracy was on point. The completion rate itself wasn't the best, but he 61% completion rate for him, but an 87% accuracy rating, courtesy of PFF, which does have a lot of the XFL data, by the way. We are going to talk about a lot of data points here. To me, Sal actually turned me on to it earlier in the week. PFF is the one site that I found has all the data readily available in a way that's palatable to scrape if you are putting together either projections or a data sheet like I try to do for these. So that's one thing worth noting as well. But Cardale, to me, he seems kind of sneaky in week two here. I think a lot of people are going to go to Phillip Walker, as they should. He looked phenomenal in week one. But Cardale here, I think he's got upside. I mean, he was passing enough. They didn't really need to push the action much more than they did. But Cardale also ran. He was accurate enough. He's got talented receivers here. Is Cardale in play for you, or is the price still a little bit tough to swallow, given that if you're going to pay up for a guy, it does seem like Walker is a much safer option?
Yeah, so I think Walker's completely fine, and we'll definitely chat about him. But Cardale Jones, I like a lot. The price doesn't move since last week, and probably going to go under the radar a little bit. So, yeah, he was graded number one quarterback, a 116.7 rating, and he was great in a game where they had a special teams touchdown and they had a defensive score. So, similar to Matt McGloin, I mean, with the defensive touchdown in New York, he just didn't have to throw the ball as much, was limited to less than 30 attempts here, but he averaged 9 yards per attempt. I think that at this $10,200 tag, he looks fine. My only concern, just looking at some of the pressure rating stats, New York was the number one team week one in pressure rating, even on neutralizing stats to kind of take away just what the offensive line was doing against them, trying to make it a little bit more neutralized so you can weight it and look at different matchups. But they were number one in that department. And Cardale Jones was only kept clean on 62% of his dropbacks, which is not that great. The average last week was around 75% for quarterbacks. So that would be my only concern, is the fact that he might not have as much time. We saw this trickle into their running game, their run blocking scheme. Like a lot of teams in the XFL, you don't have a lot of parity on your offensive line yet. Not enough chemistry, was not that great. So that's the only concern at this price point. He is mobile, though. We saw a couple fantasy points on the ground last week. So, yeah, Cardale Jones is one of the quarterbacks that I like a lot this week.
Yeah, he's got some weapons as well, and we'll talk about them. I guess we might as well just move over to that now, because I do want to hit on the running backs, because I think we talked about Presley for a second before, but a guy really disappointed me in week one. I was very bullish on him, but I do think week two portends a little better. But the wide receivers here, Eli Rogers really dominated the looks there. 25% target share for him in week one, 7 targets, 7 catches as well for him. So he did everything he needed to do. Deep targets, Rashad Ross was the guy who was getting the deep looks there. But they did, as we kind of speculated last week, they really were not as confident in Ross as you would think. And this week, DeAndre Tompkins is going to be available for them. So how do you feel about this wide receiver group? Malachi Dupree, also a guy we talked about his value last week, we both felt pretty good about. He ran the routes, he was out there, but he really didn't get any targets overall. This wide receiver group, are you interested in any of these guys? And I guess, are you willing to pay the premium prices for Ross and Rodgers? Or are you more interested in going down to a guy like Tompkins, who kind of, to me, I worry about him basically being Dupree, a guy who looks good on paper, but is not going to have the production when he's actually out there?
Yeah, so starting at the most expensive guy, Rashad Ross, I have no interest in cash games. I really don't even have much interest in tournaments at this point, at the price point that you're getting him at. He only ran 21 routes last week, was listed as the wide receiver 3. He played like that. Now DeAndre Tompkins comes in. Even if Ross stays as like a 20 route guy, most of his targets will be downfield, so that keeps him viable in GPPs. But he's now priced as a guy that is going to go out there and run maybe half the routes of some of the other guys in this 10K range. So at 9,900, I don't have much interest there. Rodgers, I think, is fine. The price point comes up. He ended up leading the team in target share last week. He ran 88% of his routes out of the slot, all of the 25 of them. So that was great to see. He sort of had like as good of a game as you can, though. Caught all 7 of his targets for 73 yards. Only one of those passes was thrown more than 20 yards downfield. So he's another guy who at 9,700, yeah, I think he's one of the better receivers in the league. Definitely one of the better route runners. But when you're priced up this high, it's how much can you actually get out of it? It becomes very difficult when it's a slot wide receiver trying to pay this off in an offense, like we said, that has other weapons. So I prefer Rodgers to Ross. But I think the guy I would get to the most is Tompkins. There is uncertainty, like you said. Dupree did lead the team last week in routes, just didn't come through. No targets in the second half hurts. They ended up throwing a lot less. But if Tompkins right now is still listed as number one in the depth chart, that's where he was coming into it. I don't think anybody did anything last week to overtake that from him. Definitely not Dupree. Ross had the deep touchdown, but nothing else other than that. So yeah, Tompkins at 3,600, similar to Joe Horn. We got to see what Horn did last week, but I do think that Tompkins will just go really unowned if I had to guess. I don't know if anybody's doing ownership projections, but my guess would be he didn't play last week coming off of an injury. Not a lot of noise will be around his name, but I'm expecting him to start, run 25 plus routes, and at 3,600 with one of the better quarterbacks in the league, I have a good amount of interest.
I agree. And I think he does come up with awesome projections as well. Tompkins, a pretty good value play just because of not being in there for week one. I do think it's worth noting, though, in terms of slot defense, and I've been trying, I normally for the NFL don't look as much at individual matchups because I do think there's a lot of noise in there. But for the XFL, I think, with the defenses being mostly unknown quantities, I do think it's worth a look. And in week one, Dravon Askew Henry was the guy who was doing most of the slot coverage for New York. And he was really the one weak spot they had in that group where AJ Handy did cover a little bit of the slot, gave up really no passes at all, no completions on 2 targets. Outside as well, Jamar Summers was really strong, giving up a 39 QB rating. But Askew Henry gave up a 117 QB rating to the slot, gave up 4 targets, 3 catches on him, 58 slot yards. So 2.3 yards per coverage snap for Askew Henry there. I do think Rodgers is interesting, and Sammy Coates is a guy we'll talk about in a bit. I like him again. We were very bullish on him last week, or at least I was very bullish on him last week. He completely bombed there. And Coates does project really well this week, but I think Askew Henry's defense is so bad, and Rodgers is getting that work out of the slot that I'd be willing to take some stabs on him. And I do think he's a guy at that price point who would be a pivot potentially to a guy who's a similar price in Coates. Run game here, Sal. Presley got the work in week one, got 12 carries, also got 2 targets and caught both those balls as well. Donnell Pumphrey did get some of the goal line work, but was really not as involved overall. Is Presley in play for you? Because to me, I still do believe in the talent. I thought he looked good when he got touches. The workload is not as big as some of the other guys who we can hit on as we go. But I do think in this spot here, New York's run defense really didn't look good. Davion Smith was really destroying them in week one. Presley, to me, is a guy who I do think is going to go under the radar and under owned after he busted last week. But run game for you, Sal. Any of these guys look good?
Yeah, Presley would be the guy. And 14 touches week one, it was good to see. I do have concerns, at least after 1 week, of what their offensive line looked like. It was terrible. He had like 1 or 2 carries where he was able to hit the hole, but other than that, it was just a lot of bundled up in the backfield, as it was for a lot of these running backs. So ran 13 routes. Again, that's pretty much average from what we saw week one for a lot of these running backs. Did see those 2 targets and catches. So I'm fine getting to Presley here. The touches are okay. Again, he's in a backfield where only 2 running backs ended up touching the ball, him and Pumphrey last week. They split the routes run down the middle, 26 total. So I'm okay getting to Presley. I think he's one of the better options this week. He's priced like it at that point as well, but he looks okay. Ended up getting 75% of the running back carries last week.
Yeah, and Presley to me is a guy I'm willing to take some stabs on. I think for me, I was a little too heavy on him last week, though. I'm sure you could say that about a lot of guys. And we talked about Cameron Artis-Payne earlier. Certainly the biggest bust of the week, but Presley was right there for me as well. Still willing to go back there this week. Again, this New York defense to me didn't look good in the run game last week. And it does seem like DC, in terms of their run rate, they did rush 50% of the time. So it does seem like they do want to run enough here where there could be work for Presley to do. Let's keep going on to game 2 here. Another one on Saturday. Tampa Bay heading into Seattle. Tampa Bay a 3-point favorite again on the road. They are a persistent road favorite, even though they got smoked in week 1. Though, again, as we mentioned earlier, a bit of unluckiness. Seattle projected for 20.8 implied points. They look probably like the worst team overall in the XFL in week 1. Tampa Bay, 23.8 implied points for them. We talked about the QB situation here, but I guess just to kind of close the loop on it, Cornelius, Flowers, are any of these guys you think actually going to make a lineup for you or make, let's say, more than just kind of fractional amounts?
Yeah, if Cornelius starts, there's a chance that I have some of him just because of the price point. I haven't put together or really built any lineups or even did any crunches yet at this point. The top quarterbacks in terms of like some of those top guys in pricing, we talked about Cardale Jones. We'll talk about some of the other ones. They're the priorities for me this week. But if I had a couple of shares of Cornelius at 6,700, because we don't have as much value this week, last week you were able to leave thousands of dollars on the table. This week it's going to be harder to do that. So if you want to play some of the more premier wide receivers, and that's what it comes down to at this point, getting him into a lineup and just loading up on those top end wide receivers could be interesting. That being said, it wasn't like they had one of the more elite offensive lines last week or anything like that. So it's a sketchy situation where he can easily come off the field 50% of the time for Flowers. So Cornelius, if anything, like earlier, if Flowers does draw the start, there'd be more interest. But right now I'm going to project Cornelius to start.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And we talked about it again a little bit ago, but Flowers does seem a little trappy this week, and he projects well currently for Osimo. But I think once that the news trickles down to Osimo's projections, I do think Flowers will come down a little bit here. If Murray's out, obviously it would open up some theoretical opportunity. But if Cornelius is getting all the first team reps, it does show that they're still treating Flowers a little more like a Taysom Hill than an actual guy who's going to be in at quarterback in a meaningful way. Are we willing to go to the receivers here? Because Dan Williams is really one of the best plays, one of the best under the radar plays in week one. 32% target share for him. He paid it off with 123 receiving yards, 9 targets, 6 catches on it. Guy looked good. And one thing that I was worried about, which one of the guys, Johnny Sack in the premium Slack, kind of, assuaged my concerns about. But Dan Williams, they mentioned it during the game, but he basically lived with Aaron Murray, or at least moved near to him, nearby him in the offseason for the XFL because he wanted to get in. Williams clearly working hard, and he looked good in week one, but the price is up now, and the quarterback situation is in flux. Are you willing to go to Dan Williams here? Are you willing to trust that workload? Because to me, I think Jalen Tolliver is a very comparable play. Didn't have the same results in week one, but he's much cheaper. I'm willing to kind of take that stab because he was getting the deep looks and was at least as involved in terms of routes. 42 routes for Dan Williams in week one, 40 for Jalen Tolliver.
Yeah, so you touched on it. They were both, it was a game where they were trailing by 2 to 3 scores most of the game versus New York. So they ran a ton of routes. One, Dan Williams, like you said, I think they said on the broadcast that he was the roommate of Aaron Murray. So that would make sense. So it was evident in the second half, like every single drop back, he didn't have a lot of time, Murray, and he was just throwing it to Williams on all those targets, the 9 that he had. He actually had 2 drops, so it could have been a little bit of a better game, but only one of them was a deep target compared to Tolliver's 2 deep targets on his 7 overall targets. So it's a little bit sketchier now with no Murray. It makes me come off of Williams only because, one, the quarterback play is changing. They were trailing by so much, so it was almost forcing just the quicker throws because of some of their offensive line concerns. But the other thing is just that he had the biggest performance. He leads the XFL in receiving yards. If any type of player sees that this week, he's probably a guy in that 7K range that is just an easy insertion into your lineup. So I actually do prefer Tolliver as well. I'll still have some Dan Williams, but I have Tolliver ranked a little bit higher right now. He's also a lot cheaper in the $3,000 range. Ended up seeing those 7 targets last week. And also worth mentioning, it's only 1 week of play, but Seattle had the lowest overall secondary grading after 1 week.
Yeah, I think that all makes sense to me. And I'm glad we're kind of on the same page as Tolliver. He was a guy that I think last week we were like, boy, he's really projecting well for Osimo, and, didn't come through, but projections are a median outcome. And I do think this week can be the week that Tolliver does explode. Maybe some people feel burned by him last week, but as we both mentioned, the workload is there for him. 25% target share, and the deep looks were there as well. Also 10 yards after the catch. Both he and Dan Williams were doing a good job running after the catch. The Williams was helped out by a couple of really big grabs. Anybody else in this receiving core interesting to you? Truesdale was in the mix as well. Reese Horn was a guy I liked in week one. Didn't quite come through, but was their primary slot guy. 21 slot routes, targeted 4 times in the slot. I think he's fine, though Tolliver, I think, has more big playability. Truesdale, Horn, anybody else here look good to you on Tampa Bay's pass game?
No, wide receiver, it's really just Tolliver and Williams. Prefer Tolliver. Truesdale, I think it'll be interesting moving forward. Had that big fumble last week that turned into a touchdown, but I think he's just appropriately priced at 6,700. And there's guys like Tolliver who seem a little bit underpriced. I probably won't get to much Horn at the same price range as Tolliver.
Yeah, Truesdale being targeted like a tight end, 20% target per route. So he's, right where you'd expect an NFL tight end. Guys like Kittle and Kelsey kind of in that same range in the NFL for comparison's sake. So he's being used well, but at his price point, I would agree. I'd much rather find the money to go to Dan Williams or go a little bit cheaper, go down to Jalen Tolliver. Run game here. Davion Smith, one of the few guys here who had a gigantic workload. I think you can make an argument too, other than, some costly turnovers by Smith. He had that one fumble there, but 79 rushing yards, 4.3 yards after contact. He looked good. The workload was there for him. He also had one of the best pass game opportunities overall, ran 20 routes. Only saw 1 target though. Davion Smith to me is a guy I'm willing to pay up for. He's the top price running back on the slate, but I feel like it's well-deserved. Are you with Davion Smith this week? Do you think you'll have some exposure, or are you trying to move away because maybe you're just not buying in?
I think it's hard to move away from him when you have – look, he's the most expensive running back, and I think DraftKings did a really good job pricing pretty much all around the board this week. Wide receivers, still some guys they're a little bit lower on. But, yeah, I think Davion Smith looks fine. The price tag seems fine to me. Number 2 in overall running back touches behind Matt Jones last week. He had 16 carries and a and 1 reception. He ended up running the second most routes, which I think is something really interesting. He ran 21 routes, only one of 2 running backs to do that. The other one was Cameron Artis-Payne, who ran 22 routes. I'm not going to technically Nick Colley still listed as a running back, but he played wide receiver. So he had elite usage in the passing game as a running back. He was getting the ball a ton. Number 2 in elusive rating. And the thing that probably stands out the most is this team trailed by a touchdown to 2 touchdowns, pretty much 2 touchdowns or more for 3 quarters. And he still got that much usage. So even if a backup comes in and they get behind in this game, which they're facing, like we said, probably the worst team after week 1, I don't expect that to happen. But even if they get down, it seems like he'll still be in line for a good amount of usage.
And one thing that jumps out to me too, I talked about it earlier with Tampa Bay being unlucky, but 4 red zone visits for them, no red zone touchdowns. And also in those 4 red zone visits, they got to goal to go in all 4 of them and just didn't convert. That's going to turn around, I think, for them. And Davion Smith, certainly a guy who should be involved as well. He looks like the guy who should be the red zone back. There's Jacques Patrick is in the mix, and I guess it's just worth mentioning. Do you think Patrick is worth potentially some exposure as a pivot play? Because he did get 8 carries, did get 3 targets, so more targets than Smith, despite less routes run. Is Patrick at all in play for you, or do you feel like that was just kind of an aberration because of the game flow?
I think it can. I think it can keep up, and that's actually really important mentioning. Like, you factor in that Smith had 16 carries and a reception, so 17 total touches, but Patrick had 8 carries as well. So they ran the ball 24 times with their 2 running backs, even though they were down by 14 to 20 most of that game. So very surprising, you would say, but good to see for fantasy moving forward for security reasons. I'm not going to get to much Patrick just because I want to roster just 1 running back per team and really 1 running back overall in my lineups, and he's probably not the upside pivot that I would get to this week.
Yeah, 71 plays run by Tampa Bay in week 1, which is one of the higher marks in the league. They were one of the teams actually came through on the initial play per game prediction that we had. So going to be some room for Tampa Bay to produce here. And again, they do seem like a team due for positive regression. Going against a Seattle team who did not look good. So let's talk about that side. Brandon Silvers, I did not check for news this morning here, just didn't have the time, unfortunately. But Silvers has at least had not practiced the last that I had checked. BJ Daniels is the backup there. Is there any news on Silvers here? Because Silvers did have the opportunity to do more. He just was pretty terrible in week 1. Had the second most deep targets overall, 7 deep throws, only converted 1 of them. Did throw for 3 touchdowns, though, partly because of the game script and trailing from behind.
Yeah, so Silvers with the ankle injury, they listed him, I believe these go out maybe last night or this morning is when I looked. They listed him as probable with an ankle injury. So right now, no reason to speculate BJ Daniels.
He was a full participant yesterday, it looks like. So I think
gotcha. Yeah. So he's probable. And honestly, this team in general doesn't really do much for me at this point. I'm not going to have interest in Silvers. He's appropriately priced for a quarterback who just isn't going to be doing much. And I'd rather pay up for these other guys. He ended up having, I believe it was 5.4 yards per attempt, ended up being tied with Knopf as the lowest on the week. So just not great last week overall for Silvers. He did look decent early on. He just couldn't put it all together. And the issue for him was just deep passes. He ended up hitting Bird early on, who filled in for, I believe, Williams for a 28-yard catch. It was really nice over the shoulder towards the left side of the field, right around the sideline. But after that, he just didn't do much. I think there's a lot better options than Silvers.
Yeah, well, one thing that worries me too, which again with PFF stats, a good insight into how the guy actually performed in a clean pocket. He had a 42.6 QB rating, which is probably going to come up a little bit because he is a quarterback in a professional football league. But if a guy can't do that well in a clean pocket, and he saw clean pockets 71% of the time, so a pretty good mark for him. Silvers just may not be a guy who's competent, and it wouldn't be surprising to see BJ Daniels get some work here. And this is an offense that does seem like they want to be able to throw. Especially more than you would think given the running backs they have here. But it looks like a bit of a crappy situation overall. Silver certainly contrarian, did get the workload, but did not look there talent-wise overall. Receivers, though, Austin Proehl, despite Silver's mediocrity, Proehl went nuts, had the 2 touchdowns in that game. Also saw 10 targets, only caught 5 of them, but was clearly one of the more involved targets. Keenan Reynolds, though, running a comparable amount of routes, actually running more routes, 10 more routes than Austin Proehl, but just did not have the same explosiveness, did not have the same separation it looked like. Reynolds, Proehl, Kason Williams still out. Dantes Bird, I think, still a guy who's in the mix for me. He saw 4 deep targets in that last game, and he's a guy we talked about last week. I think he's got more upside than it may seem. But Proehl, Reynolds, Bird, any of these guys popping up to you at all, Sal?
Yeah, so I guess So none of them stand out as more of like priority plays. Prohl's a guy that I'm fine just getting away from this week. We saw him have the big game, 5 catches, 88 yards and 2 touchdowns on the 10 targets. So the target share was nice to see, a slot wide receiver getting that. Catch rate, not that great, but he had the 50-plus yard touchdown, which skews a lot. And I'm pretty sure this will end up being just a ceiling game for him. And now you're getting him at probably what ends up being his highest price point of the season. If I had to guess moving forward, you're getting him in the right here, the 7K range at this point. So it's priced up to a spot where I don't feel the need to get there. 9,200, I was looking at Williams, and $9,200 is just not a spot that I'm going to get to. 25% target share last week, which is fine, but you factor in bad quarterback play, probably won't get there. Keenan Reynolds, you saw Silvers attempt 7 deep passes, second most in the league, which was encouraging, kind of forced to do that after going down. But even Reynolds at that point, the bad quarterback play really limited him. Kason Williams is going to miss again this week, so you'll see some more Bird. If anything, at the price point of $3,800 for Bird, the fact that he did get those deep targets, I'd throw a dart there, but I don't have any of these Seattle wide receivers in a player pool right now.
Yeah, they are a home dog, which I do think has some upside theoretically. But yeah, to me, Bird, Prohl, Reynolds, certainly guys I don't want to have a ton of, but I think a little bit of exposure here does make sense because Silvers, again, was thrown. He just sucked, and maybe he sucks less than it seemed. But again, he did look very much like he sucked. Three-headed running back committee here with Kenneth Farrow, Trey Williams, and Jaquan Gardner. Gardner was a named starter there, but he really wasn't as involved as you would think. Did lead the team in rushes, but didn't get any targets, didn't run any routes. Farrow and Williams both looked pretty sharp. Williams was a better pass game back, or at least got a little more pass game work. Farrow probably the most complete back out of them, but it is a 3-man committee here, one where for a Seattle team that does not look the best, and also didn't run at a high rate either, just a 33% run rate for him in week 1, though they were trailing from behind, so that could be part of it as well. But Farrow, Williams, Gardner, will you have any of these guys, Sal, or is the 3-man approach here, and prices really that don't reflect a 3-man approach, is that ruling these guys out for you?
Yeah, for the most part, it is. I mean, we saw Gardner get the start, which was surprising, but at the price point, it was interesting last week just because we didn't know how it was going to go. But then they ended up pretty much just splitting everything. You had Gardner having 9 carries. Farrow, when you factor in his receiving work, he had 11 total touches. And Trey Williams ended up, after his receiving work, having 7 total touches. So it was just split right down the middle. Farrow was the expected number 1 running back on the depth chart before they named Gardner last week. So seeing him get the most work overall was at least encouraging moving forward, but they're all priced as if they're going to get that type of work, and it's just not guaranteed. Reminds me a lot of just the Tampa Bay Bucks in the NFL. So after 1 week, Trey Williams, I believe, was actually their first running back pick off the board. So it seems like just draft stock-wise, talent-wise, all these guys are going to get the ball, and when you're only trying to roster 1 to 2 running backs, it's just the least interesting spot. If I had to pick one of them just to have in a player pool, it would be Farrow, but none of them are really that appealing.
Yeah, I agree. I think there are guys here who does seem like will have a more concentrated workload, and does not seem like the Seattle guys are that. But if that changes, these guys do have talent. I think Farrow and Trey Williams, to me, just eye test wise, 2 of the guys that looked one of the better running back duos in the league. And both guys too, 5.7 yards per rush for Farrow, 5.3 for Williams. These guys have some burst and some explosiveness, and they could be useful if they get more work moving forward. Let's keep going here. We got Dallas heading into Los Angeles for a game. Dallas, a 4-point favorite on the road. Los Angeles, I don't know if this also has changed, but not expected to have Josh Johnson the last that I looked. But Dallas expected to get Landry Jones in there. He's been announced as a starter. He's a limited participant in practice, but it does seem like he'll be a full go. Landry Jones projects pretty well for Osmo. Philip Nelson, just a garbage player. He really had the opportunity last week, had 43 pass attempts, completed 79% of them, but terrified to throw it more than 5 yards. The running back checkdowns were just his move over and over and over again. He was just terrifying, terrible to watch, just frustrating to watch. But Jones, it seems like he's got a little more gunslinger in him. He's been one of the high-profile guys the XFL's put out there. Landry Jones, is he in play for you? Because this offense seems like it should be better than it was in week 1, where they just got crushed by St. Louis's defense, but it seemed like that was mostly Nelson's fault.
Yeah, and I agree. I think Landry Jones, especially at 9,500, I think that's a really nice price on him. I do like him this week. So Dallas kept Philip Nelson clean 80.4% of the time last week, which was the second most in the league behind Philip Walker. Walker's rates are going to be because he could actually run and be a little bit mobile. But Nelson's is interesting because I'm pretty sure it was just like what you mentioned, dump-offs. I think he attempted 15 of his attempts were to the 4 running backs, which is not great to see 4 active running backs in the receiving game for them. But Landry Jones is going to change that up a little bit. You'll have a lot more uses for Jeff Badette, who was their number one overall pick, the wide receiver, played in the AAF, has a ton of speed on the outside, so that helps Badette a lot. I think Landry Jones is a big spike for this offense. One of the, like you said, more talented players in this league, at least on paper. 9,500 puts him in that tier of probably the 3 guys this week that I'll have priority interest in.
So the guys who led in targets in week 1 were Flynn Nagel, Donald Parham. Guys, Nagel is a slot guy. Parham also ran mostly out of the slot, but he's more of a tight end kind of guy. Again, Philip Nelson afraid to throw it deep. So do you think this workload changes around? Because in week 1, Nagel had a 21% target share. Parham had the same. Badette only had 14% target share for him, 11% for Jazz Ferguson, 14% for Sean Price. Do you think this switches around and the outside receivers get a boost? Because I think it's a real leap of faith for Jeff Badette right now, where if you play him, you are playing him at a really high price. And Osmo's projection for him looks pretty bad. So it's, to me, one of the biggest leaps of faith you could take on the slate.
Yeah, so you only saw Nelson attempt 2 deep passes, tied for Murray with the least in the league, but he didn't complete any of them, which was the only person not to do that. So he looked terrible. So I think Landry Jones definitely helps. And yeah, Badette had the most routes run at 30 last week. I actually like Badette a good amount this week. I don't think he'll be owned because of how bad of a performance. 3 receptions, I believe, for 6 yards last week. That was. I think Jones is going to change that up a little bit for Badette this week. And yeah, at that point, you're just betting on more of the talent. He is priced in the 8K range, which if you get anywhere near what happened last week, it's clearly a terrible price point, but I'll bank on it being similar to what we were expecting, or at least some of the hype for Badette last week coming in. I'll blame it more so on terrible quarterback play. I'll take 30 routes run with Jones under center, and at 8,700, he does look appealing to me.
Yeah, one of the outside corners as well, Jalen Dunlop, was probably their worst corner on the Los Angeles side in week 1. Gave up 8 targets, 4 completions on them, but they were good for 67 yards, 1.8 yards per coverage snap for him, and a 118 QB rating given up. So Dunlap can be a guy to target. It does seem like there should be more outside production. And I do think Nagel and Parham were kind of propped up by Nelson just being it's weird. Like, this is your shot to be in the XFL, to be in the limelight, and you're just terrified to throw deep. Like, take your shots. Just, I don't know. That just was a crazy game here, but Dallas should be a more progressive team. Maybe the hope for them was that they'd be like Houston, and Houston we saw really air it out. Hopefully Landry Jones gets them more on point. Run game here. Lance Dunbar popping up for me a lot with Osmo's projections. Did get a lot of that pass game work in week 1, though Cameron Artis-Payne did lead the team in routes run in the running backs, amongst the running backs rather. But as Sal mentioned, a lot of guys involved there. Artis-Payne, Dunbar, Marquise Young also involved at kind of a comparable level. Are any of these guys worth it to you? Is Dunbar a guy you'd go to, or you want to go back to Cameron Artis-Payne, or is Dallas a stay away for the run game?
I think they're a stay away for me. If anything, I would go to Dunbar just based on price points this week, but you ended up seeing Artis-Payne still lead the running backs in overall snaps, which was good. I mean, he salvaged his day only having 2 carries with his 4 receptions. I think he had 3 of them within 4 plays. So he ended up just getting really lucky at that point. Had a 25-yard carry called back, but at the end of the day, they had 4 running backs play at least 14 snaps. Young played 14, Walter 15, Dunbar 23, and Artis-Payne 32. So that's just not appealing. All 4 of them were running routes as well, and actually a good amount of routes. So you had Young running 9 routes last week. Walter ran 11. Dunbar ran 15, and then you had Artis-Payne lead all running backs at 22. So it's just it's a brutal situation. Whenever there's 4 running backs active in any league, even the NFL, it's sort of a stay away spot. It usually means at least 3 of them are getting work, and to see 4 of them get that much work is concerning. So as of right now, I'm going to stay away unless something in the future changes.
Yeah, a pretty bad run defense for Los Angeles, graded out as a 53 grade from PFF. So theoretically, there's opportunity there, but as Sal mentioned, 4 guys there, just maybe a little bit too much. And, and you could definitely make arguments that Dunbar looked like the best one. Artis-Payne definitely got the most work, but it's a tough one, and one that maybe I'd be a little bit less inclined to trust. And again, same reasons as well with Nelson. Just going to be less checkdowns probably with Landry Jones, though he's not a mobile quarterback. So, there'll still be some checkdowns, but probably not the same amount as Nelson throughout there, who, by the way, established the run, loves calling him an underwear model to mock him, which I feel like we should support guys who are underwear models. If he's that handsome, he can play quarterback at least well enough to be in a league. I think that's like, Sal, you and I are not underwear models unless you have something you want to share with the people that we don't know about your past.
No, nothing there.
Maybe one day we can aspire to be the first DFS underwear models. We can one day. achieve that. White Claw as well. White Claw sponsorship, underwear modeling, all the things I'm aspiring to. Los Angeles aside, really a dumpster fire again. Josh Johnson still limited in practice. Really not looking good. Does seem like he's trending towards not playing. They also added a quarterback from Team 9, which is the free flowing kind of, I don't know how you'd even explain it, but they're basically held like an actual exit, like a roster. They're practicing and stuff. They have coaching staffs, they have training and all that. But teams can then cherry pick guys from it. They added one of the QBs from there, who actually I don't have on my list. But the assumption is that with Knopf also not starting, Jalen McClendon, who looked real bad in mop-up duty in that last game, seems like he's going to be the starter here. And Sal, I guess you agree that McClendon's looking like he'll start, or you think there's something else going here?
Yeah, I mean, so you just had limited tags on Josh Johnson for like the last 2 weeks at this point. So unless something changes, we'll get official word later today, maybe within like an hour or soon on if he's going to be questionable, ruled out. So we'll see at that point. I haven't seen anything unofficially ruled out, but trending at best to be questionable at this point. So even if he plays Josh Johnson at that price point, 10-4, I don't really have much interest. But yeah, if he's out, it just makes everything else around them worse, and no interest in McClendon.
So do we trust Nelson Spruce here? Because he was one of the other big stories. Dan Williams, Nelson Spruce, two guys who really jumped off the page. Spruce, 15 targets, 11 catches on him, 103 yards in the receiving game. There are no touchdowns, but he just looked like a guy that, Bill Belichick would watch this tape and be like, this is my dude. Like he might get some cap invites off that one game alone. Ran 46 routes, 33% targets per route, 54% target share for him. Are we trusting Spruce again at his price point? Because he's also got a pretty good matchup as well. Again, worth noting the coverage for him, Deshaun Phillips in the slot, one of the worst slot coverage guys in week 1. Gave him a 119 QB rating, 2.7 yards per coverage snap, 65 yards overall. So Phillips could be primed to take advantage of again. But also Jordan Smallwood in the mix, much cheaper, actually he is much cheaper. He's not cheap overall. Adonis Jennings also getting work. Are any of these guys appealing to you, or is it Spruce or bust?
Yeah, this is a really tough situation because of just the overall quarterback shuffling at this point. Spruce is the guy who stands out the most, but now he's the most expensive wide receiver. So I have a good amount of interest in him, but he's not like my number one wide receiver play like the price point indicates. He was the top graded guy last week. He ran 89% of his routes out of the slot, which was surprising to see that much usage out of the slot for him. And Dallas, like you said, some bad cornerbacks, at least after week 1. They ranked 7th out of the 8 teams in coverage last week. So at 10-4, I'd be fine getting to some of them. Just not – I would probably put him right around like a top 5 option this week at wide receiver for me currently, but nothing stands out overall. But the whole team looks interesting because Saeed Blacknall ran 43 routes, all wind sprints, no catches on 4 targets, but they were deep targets, but he hasn't practiced yet this week, and it doesn't seem like he's going to play. Trey McBride isn't on the injury report the last 2 days, but there's been no official status update after he missed.
I think he was already ruled out somewhere.
Has he been?
I saw that. Yeah.
Yeah, because I was looking at the injury report and I saw nothing.
Maybe unruled him out, but I think I saw earlier in the week that he was expected not to play. And what I'm seeing now, it just says status unclear. So I'm actually not sure, but I thought he was going to be out.
Yeah, no. So I didn't see anything on him. So that's what I was like waiting for them to just say ruled out or just questionable or not on injury report. But okay, that's good to know then. So so Blacknall status is actually really important at this point because it opens up just much more work for a guy like Jordan Smallwood, who at 6,900, I don't have as much interest in him. But if you have no Blacknall, I'd imagine the routes, 28 routes last week, you probably see that in a close game. If they start to get blown out again, if there's no Josh Johnson, you can sort of expect that with Landry Jones on the other side. Smallwood might be in line for around 35 routes or so. So if there's no Blacknall, if McBride is indeed out, then Smallwood is going to be interesting to me and Spruce. But I don't even at flat minimum. Jennings got to start last week. He's $3,000, so he's at least worth a nod. But they didn't put him on the field all that much, and it was pretty quick for Smallwood to kind of they had a short leash on Jennings, it seemed, and Smallwood just came on and got a lot more work there.
Yeah, and Jennings also picked up some routes with Spruce out of the game at the end as well, running out of the slot. Levante Whitfield as well also got some of that garbage time. So a couple guys there, vaguely interesting, but probably not worth most exposure. Again, McClendon, if he's starting, just did not look ready at all. Either one of the guys who just seemed out of his depth. Kind of a bummer because I think he was a decent player at Baylor, but a dude who just did not seem like he should be good to go. But we'll see. It does seem like this LA team is going to be a bit of a disaster. Run game, though, I guess fast. Anybody interesting to you here? Elijah Hood here was touted as being the workhorse guy. He did get the majority of the carries, did get 12 rushes, but Larry Rose got the majority of the pass game work. It seemed like Hood didn't run a single route, actually. I don't like any of these guys, but Sal, do you like anybody for LA in the run game?
Hood, it would be like a fifth or so. We're right around their option at running back this week, so not a priority option. But yeah, he had elite snaps, 55, 37 more than Rose was the widest gap on the entire week between a starter and their backup. But he came off the field for Rose in passing down situations, and he ended up running no routes. So in a situation where if there's no Josh Johnson, I expect them to be trailing in this game. Maybe he sees somewhere around like 12 carries, but that's just not going to be enough if you have no passing game upside. It's only 1 week that can clearly change, but it seemed like, and Rose coming out of college, he caught like 50 balls a year. He was just fantastic in college. So as a pass catcher, so I think that that's going to be their main pass catching back. Worth mentioning, DeJuan Harris has not practiced yet this week. So that's who was slated as their backup running back last week, ended up being the third string. If he's not out there, it can help a little bit, but Hood's the only guy I have in a player pool, not a priority.
Yeah, I agree with you there. It's just, not the most appealing situation for LA. Also the Dallas defense, I think, certainly didn't look great in week 1 against St. Louis and Teemu, but we'll talk about Teemu in a second. But, it does seem like they're in play again, which is an LA team who's going to be out of sorts this week, it looks like. Game 4 here, last game on the slate, St. Louis heading into Houston. St. Louis, an 8-point dog, despite a really impressive game for them. One of the most run-heavy teams, I really think. And last week, I kind of jokingly said that Philip Walker was the Lamar Jackson of the XFL. Philip Walker is the Patrick Mahomes of the XFL. Lamar Jackson is Jordan Ta'amu, who ran a shitload in week 1 and looked good. He's a big-body dude. He kind of had, I guess, he's probably more of a Josh Allen, if we're being honest, than Lamar Jackson, but 12 yards per rush, just ran 6 times. We got 77 rushing yards. Just a beast of a guy who was just seemed cagey in a way that I was impressed by him. Young dude too, so the book isn't out on him fully, but I think he's got upside in this spot. To me, he's one of the quarterbacks I'm willing to go to in lineups that don't have Philip Walker, who we'll talk about in a second. But I like Ta'amu a lot. I think he was one of the more impressive guys to me and a guy who I want to see a lot more of. Again, another dude who I think the NFL is going to be probably intrigued by once he has this season, if he keeps playing like he has. 74% completion rate. How do you feel about Ta'amu here in this spot here where St. Louis very likely going to trail here against the Houston team who is bombs away in week 1?
Yeah, I thought he was one of the more exciting players week 1. Jordan Ta'amu, like you were saying, he's a guy who, like the XFL in general can really thrive on if he does well in this league and then makes the jump to the NFL, even if it's just a backup or a practice squad player, because he hasn't had really any professional tape. So any college players that either don't want to go into the draft and use this as their more or they're going to be like a late round pick and they don't think they'll get picked, they can use this. It's a really good platform for them. And he looked really good week 1. He was the number 2 player in breakaway percentage, including all running backs. He was the number 6 player in elusive rating, only player in the XFL to have 3 carries of 10 plus yards. So just looked really good overall, Ta'amu. The problem is he's 8,900, not expensive at all. I mean, factoring in all the starters, if you were to have Aaron Murray starting this week, he'd be one of the cheaper ones. He still is. So I have some interest. He's in a player pool for me right now. The rushing upside of those 77 yards on the ground were great. Houston, for what it's worth, week 1 was a really good pressure team. Number 2, coverage was pretty solid as well. Quarterback play that they were facing was not great, though. So Ta'amu I have listed right now as my 4th starter behind the Philip Walkers, Cardale Jones, and Landry Joneses. So not a guy that I expect to get too much. If you're in a situation when you're building lineups and you're like $500 away from a guy that you really feel confident in at wide receiver or running back, and it means you have to come off of a Landry Jones to get to Ta'amu, whatever it might be, I'm okay doing that. I think there's enough upside in him.
Are we saying Ta'amu or Ta'amu? Like I feel like I heard the announcer say Ta'amu, so that's what I'm going with. But last week I was saying Ta'amu. This is the one, my least favorite part of the XFL is like these names. I'm just like, I don't know. Nobody's ever said them out loud. I feel like
yeah. So I looked on. I do this with golfers too, just like guys in like the 6K range. But I just looked on YouTube for like an interview with him after the game, and that I'm just judging it off of the way this single man said it for whatever college station. I think it was like Mississippi, so SEC or something. He said Ta'amu, but that is the smallest sample of trying to get the guy's name right.
That level of research, though, I feel like I have to give you a round of applause. It's commendable.
I just typed in Jordan Ta'amu interviews onto YouTube.
Look, Ta'amu seems he's interviewed on the sideline, a little out of breath a couple times there, but Pat McAfee seemed like he loved Ta'amu as well. And Pat McAfee, a guy who I know personally and from Barstool, and a good dude, but he really liked Ta'amu, and I'm gonna say Ta'amu. I feel like if that's what they went with, I'll stick with it. Passers here though, so I do feel like Ta'amu is a guy kind of like Lamar Jackson. I don't know that I need to stack him this week. He spread the ball around pretty well. Also didn't really throw the ball deep too much, did kind of keep it in pocket. 85% accuracy rating for him, but he only threw two deep passes, only completed one of them. I don't really love the receivers here. Like Marcus Lucas is the best projected play, it looks like. LaDainian Washington was the guy who was out there the most. He is a bit of a burner, but really didn't get deep targets despite that. Demory Pearson L was a guy running out of the slot primarily who had good yards after catch numbers, but didn't get a ton of looks. Only 4 targets for him, but he caught all 4. Any of these wide receivers jumping you, or are you on the same page as me where you're willing to play Te'amu without a guy stacked with him?
Yeah, all these wide receivers just sort of seem so Pearson L at the $8,000 tag. I'm just not going to get there, but all the other guys just seem like okay plays. You could talk me into any of them. Washington ended up running the most routes with 32, 5 targets, looked the most NFL ready, I guess you can say, in terms of just physical appearance. So Washington, I have in a player pool. He looks interesting. Russell actually had a ton of just in terms of just quality of the targets deep downfield. That was Russell, but didn't have a ton overall. Only ran 23 routes, which is 4th most on the team. Lucas, a tight end who ran a ton of routes, saw a good amount of targets as well, but just probably not going to prioritize tight ends this week, especially I don't expect them to be as consistent moving forward. The problem is this team wants to run the ball. Their quarterback wants to run the ball, as we see after 1 week. They're going to be using a ton of running backs, so it's not that appealing. Right now, Washington's the only guy that I have in a player pool. At 4,400, I think it's an okay spot if he's going to just run a ton of routes.
The running backs you mentioned here, they are a team who ran 59% of the time. And as we mentioned, Te'amu ran a lot, but Matt Jones really got a lot of work here. 21 carries, the most in the league in week 1, 85 rushing yards, a respectable 4 yards per rush. Jones has been limited in practice this week, had some knee issues, but it does seem like he's been limited in practice. I think he's trending towards playing Christine Michael, one of the other big busts, who we were, I think, pretty much like don't play him. And that ended up being a very on-the-nose play because he just looked bad, did nothing in that spot. Jones definitely looked like the better back, also got the work here. And Keith Ford was in the mix as well. Didn't really do a ton with it, though. Actually, he was pretty good yards per rush, 6.5 yards per rush, but not a guy who I think I would expect to seize the workload from Jones or Michael right now. How are you feeling about this running situation here? Are you willing to go back to Jones? Because as we mentioned, he's one of the guys who had that workload, and it's so hard to find a consistent workload in any of these XFL teams.
Yeah, so Jones practiced limited yesterday after not practicing Wednesday. Seems like he's going to play. Keith Ford has not practiced yet this week, but not a guy who had a ton of work. You just sprinkle that off into Michael and Matt Jones. Maybe they activate a 3rd running back. But if Jones is active, definitely track his status, of course. But he'll be interesting to me. I have concerns, though, because, yes, he had the 21 attempts. That's great to see. The usage was there, and it's just hard to ignore any running back who's going to see that type of volume. But it could very much just be somewhere where now they both have 15 carries this week or 14 because he was terrible. He was 24th in elusive rating. He was the 9th grade in running back. There's only 8 teams in the league, 9th grade in running back and overall rushing grade. So what you're playing here is the fact that he had 48 snaps in 21 attempts. He doesn't become my favorite running back play, but it's just really hard to ignore that usage as long as he's active.
We have a question in the premium Slack from Aaron Dyson asking who's the favorite running back on FanDuel this week. I think Jones is in the mix for me, but it's really hard to love anybody. Davion Smith, I think, also be a guy that I would like, and Darius Victor, we talked about him earlier, a cheaper guy. But like to me, if I had to rank them, I guess, and it's sort of tough to do it, I think I'd go Davion, Matt Jones, and then Presley for me as my higher price guys, and then Victor as the dart throw cheap guy. Maybe Dunbar is also the cheap guy, but Sal, I guess if you had to rank your top running backs in the week, is Jones in there? And who would be, I guess, your number 1 and 2?
Yeah, it's tough because right now there's not really guys standing out above the rest, but I guess like a group of guys that I'm looking at would be Jones would be in there. Presley's in there, Devion Smith. Those 3 stand out. And also Nick Holley, who we haven't gotten to yet, but still listed as a running back, a slot wide receiver. It's just the price point play. So those 4 guys are probably where I look the most. Victor, I also think is interesting based on price point.
So there we go. So that's that question for Aaron. And I guess one more question before we touch on Houston, which is the main event here of the show because they are the most exciting team by far in the XFL. Herb Dean 13 asking, I'm seeing Trey McBride is being taken off the injury report. Any thought on him? We talked about him earlier, but McBride, I guess to close the loop on him, anything for you that you feel strongly about with him? I guess just the vacancy if Blacknall's out could open up some room for McBride to do something.
Yeah, so this is like right when we're done with the show, something that I'll look into and just because I didn't see him on any of these reports, and it would make sense if he was already ruled out, like you said, or if he's just not on the injury report. If McBride is going to be active for this game, and Blacknall is out, there's going to be a lot of interest in McBride for me. He's only 4,000. Blacknall, you're going to have to fill 30-plus routes run. McBride will play on the outside opposite of probably Smallwood with Spruce in the slot. So McBride becomes a very nice play. The downside is you're going to have like a third-string quarterback starting potentially in place. So McBride, a guy who was drafted really early in the XFL draft, then was traded for Rashad Ross with DC. They pretty much flipped like top 2 draft picks at that point. So yeah, McBride, as long as he's healthy and there's no Blacknall, I would expect a start for him. He was originally listed as the backup on this team on the original depth chart.
Yeah, so some more opportunity to go around, but if McClendon's starting, we talked about it earlier, just not a dude who I'd be dying to have a lot of. I think Spruce is really the guy, the only guy I would trust at any volume on Los Angeles out of the wide receivers. All right, Houston here. So Philip Walker, we touted him. He came through in a big way. Now he's the highest priced quarterback on the slate, which is the fun part of an upstart league is how the prices swing here. But Philip Walker really deserved it. 11 deep throws in week 1. Like he was doing the thing that analytically I think more teams should be doing in the NFL and the XFL. Just chuck it and see what happens and hope for the best, especially with the catch rules and a lot of things benefiting the offense. I think Walker to me looks like the best play again. Sal mentioned it earlier, but he was kept clean 85% of the time, came through in clean pockets as well, a 106.5 QB rating when he was in a clean pocket. I love Walker again. He'll be the most owned quarterback for me. He's chalky as hell though. So how are you handling Philip Walker in week 2, Sal?
Yeah, Philip Walker for me is going to be a guy that it's going to be hard to ignore him. He's up there as one of my favorite plays. It's pretty much a grouping of Walker, Carlo Jones, and Landry Jones right now for me, taking up a lot of my ownership. None of them really popping off next to the rest. So, yeah, Walker, nothing terrible to say. St. Louis couldn't get much pressure last week. Their secondary looked fine. Like you said, attempted close to 30% of his attempts deep. It's just an offense that exactly what everybody was kind of saying under June Jones. They just want to throw it a ton. No tight ends in the roster. Like it was said a ton of times last week, and they don't like to throw to the running backs. Only 9 running back routes run in the entire game. Not a lot of targets to those guys either. So they're just going to throw it downfield. They're going to go 3 wide pretty much the whole game, 4 wide a lot. And Philip Walker also has the rushing upside. The fact that he was kept clean so much is definitely a testament to the line, but probably also his mobility at that point. So, yeah, Philip Walker at 10,600. Again, it's going to be tougher to fit these higher priced players this week since it's becoming a little bit more efficient, the pricing, but I'm not totally all the way there yet. So, yeah, I think you can say he's the top option. I wouldn't argue with that too much. He's definitely a top 2 or 3 option at quarterback.
So the wide receivers here, Sammy Coates, I mentioned it earlier, just a gigantic bust in week 1, but the workload was there for him. And that's what really drove me nuts as somebody who had an absolute assload of Sammy Coates, but 9 targets for him, 5 deep targets, only caught 1 of them. He didn't have any drops, which I did think was one thing where I felt like watching the game he did, but I think I was just so mad at him that I kind of just didn't pay attention. But PFF credited him with no drops. They were all inaccurate throws by Walker, according to their metrics. Cam Phillips is the guy who did go nuts. Osmo has Coates and Phillips projected as 2 of the top receiver plays on the week in terms of raw points overall. Phillips and ran more routes. He ran 40 routes to Sammy Coates' 29. Khalil Lewis also in the mix, can have a pretty good slot matchup. Guys like Raheem Malone, Sam Mobley were also running routes. I mean, Houston's running pretty deep here. And I don't know what to do here fully. I know I'm going to have Coates again. I'm going to be really sad if he busts on me. I don't know that I trust Cam if he busts on me. I don't know if I trust Cam Phillips as much. A slow guy, but he did get the work. Sal, how are you feeling about this pass game? Are you willing to go to Coates or Phillips, or are you maybe thinking it's Khalil Lewis this week running out of the slot? Because I'm intrigued by him. He's going to be less owned. He didn't pop off in week 1. He's got a pretty good matchup in the slot this week.
Yeah, Sammy Coates I like a lot this week. The price tag comes up, which might even make more people who played him last week just more discouraged, but he was the only player in the league to see 5 passes of 20-plus yards, and he saw 2 more than anybody else. So a ton of downfield work. You talk about trying to get API access to this data. If air yards come out somewhere, or if we get API access, it's going to be probably Sammy Coates up there as one of the guys with the most air yards on this team. Was just targeted so much. It's a fine matchup versus St. Louis. Demontre Wade and I believe Rivers are their outside cornerbacks. None of them really stood off the page last week. So Coates at 9,500, the 9 targets, all that looks really good. Ran about 30 routes. I like him the most from this team. The rest of the guys saw a ton of price ups. So Cam Phillips at 8,400 was like 5K last week. Khalil Lewis was 4,100 last week. Now he's 8,900. I'll take Phillips on the outside. Was one of 2 players in the entire league outside of quarterbacks to play 100% of the snaps. I do like that. My only concern with Khalil Lewis is, the matchup in the slot is great. I think it was Spruce who played last week in the slot against this team. Yep. So Hillary, I don't even know if he was a slot cornerback. I don't know how much work they'll let him get here.
Actually,
So
no, it was Ferguson, not Ferguson. It was Nagel and Parham playing against St.
that's
Louis.
what it was. Yeah. So Hillary ended up, I think he was targeted 12 times, gave up 11 receptions. He was a slot cornerback. Lewis looks fine on paper, everything about it. 100% of his snaps were out of the slot, 26 routes run there, 6 targets. It's just a price point of 8,900 as a slot wide receiver. He could easily be the guy who sees 7 or 8 targets, but just based on the fact that they were willing to throw deep so often, I don't think that's going to change that much. So I'll prioritize Coates and Phillips. But Lewis is still in a player pool for me. Worth mentioning that we didn't really touch on him. Holly is a wide receiver, definitely. He ran all of his routes as a wide receiver, nothing in the backfield. Still listed as a running back, though, and he should also benefit from a fine slot matchup.
Yeah, 4 targets for Holly, and I guess we can talk about him with the running backs. Certainly, if you were to put a Holly and stack him up with Walker, that's a different lineup build, and I think that's one that I would be willing to take. But James Butler looked like the best running back overall. Really not a lot of workload for Andre Williams. D'Angelo Henderson also barely saw any work as well. He was good with the one snap he had in terms of avoiding tackles, but in terms of the results, had a 6-yard loss, and that was it for him on his one rush. Are you willing to go to Butler this week with the workload not being there? This is a team who really doesn't want to run a lot, but if they do run it all, it does seem like Butler's going to be the guy who got pretty much the majority. I think he might have gotten all the goal line work in week 1.
Yeah, so considering Holly as a wide receiver, Butler would be my favorite running back from this team, but I think he's more of a trap. He ended up scoring 2 touchdowns on just 11 total touches, so people might look at that a lot. Henderson got hurt in the first quarter, hasn't practiced yet this week, so I don't really expect him to play. Andre Williams after that only saw, I believe it was 8 total snaps, so it looks by all accounts to be James Butler's backfield, 44 snaps, 36 more than Williams. The problem is you saw with June Jones in college, he only threw to the running back about 9% of the time, and Butler ran 8 routes in this game. Williams ran 1. They just weren't putting running backs on the field in the passing game. So with the price point now up to 6,300, it's probably a spot. I think he's still one of the 5-6 best options just based on his workload last week. Butler in the XFL right now. But at that point, a spot I'd rather get away from, especially if people want to look at game logs at all still for a sport that doesn't have as much information. I'll probably get away from Butler. He grades out a lot like an Elijah Hood for me. Not a lot of passing game work, but maybe sees around 10, 12 carries.
Yeah, no, that seems fair. I still think the Holly build might be the most intriguing one here, just because he was getting that work out of the slot. Not great slot defense, much cheaper than Khalil Lewis. So that's one play I think that in a league where the information as it starts to trickle out there, that you're going to find a lot of concentrated ownership. That's one build that I think won't have much on it. Sal, we got to close it out here, but anything else you want to hit on before we call it quits for this week 2 in the XFL, where hopefully this week we can find the edge we got in week 1 and really hammer it home?
Yeah, no, that's pretty much it. I think the biggest thing kind of touched on at the beginning is, one, just try and watch the injury news as much as you can, not as widely reported. There's an injury report on XFL.com, but I think number 2 is just that, running backs, ton of running back by committees here. I think it's best to try not to get to 2 or 3 of those guys in the lineup.
Yep. So hopefully some lessons here again. Just we appreciate you guys watching. It's a new league. The viewership here going to be a little bit tough. So hit the like button if you're watching on YouTube. We appreciate it very much. And go to awesemo.com/join and use that promo code XFL2020 to get $40 off of our full season XFL package. It's just $50 for you if you go on there right now. And honestly, I don't like to tout these things as being like, hey, you're going to win money. Pretty decent chance you win that money back with the XFL, especially as Sal mentioned earlier, playing some cash games, taking advantage of the guys who have a really strong median projection. There's a lot of ways here to make that money back for yourself with a new league where people are just figuring it out. And the data out here, we're lucky to have the PFF access. A lot of people out there don't even know where to find stats, and it's impossible to scrape them from the XFL site without a lot of legwork. So I think there's going to be a bit of an edge in terms of the data component here. So just take advantage of it right now. XFL 2020 is the promo code at awesemo.com/join. Go follow at Sal Vetru DFS. Sal, any plugs you want to get out before we call it quits?
No, that's it. You can follow me on Twitter. I'll post some XFL injury updates and just anything else that stands out as interesting.
Yeah, and I'll be doing my personal podcast this weekend. And besides that, not doing a lot of content because of the NBA All-Star break. So we appreciate you guys watching. Enjoy the XFL's week 2. Watch it. Make sure to watch this league because if the ratings take a big tumble this week, it's probably not great, but it deserves to get another shot here for week 2. So if you're around this weekend, give it a shot. President's Day weekend, watch some XFL, enjoy it. It's a fun league. I support it, and I had a lot of fun watching the games I did in week 1. We appreciate you guys watching. See you guys again soon. Enjoy. Good luck.